my slides and everything?
Yep.
One question, can you see my mouse?
Yes.
Okay, cool, that's helpful. Okay, great. Thanks everyone for organizing the workshop and inviting me to take part in it. There's a similar workshop at Princeton a couple months ago, but it's great to see the updated work and to be able to share this with the CogSci community. I'm going to talk about a project that I've been working on, and this is really the work of David Halpern, who's a graduate student in my lab, who's starting at UPenn in the fall. And it's about thinking about how we can use these new approaches for online data collection to constrain models of cognition and brain function. So when we think about scaling cognitive science, some of the work is undoubtedly technical, like the kind of things that Jordan was just talking about, building new platforms, scaling analysis tools and things like that. But some of this work also has to be methodological, I think. Like, how do we pull noisy and partially similar samples together that might come from different crowd working populations or lab and online samples? How do we combine information from these when not all measurements are able to be made on everyone? Like, we might not be able to get eye tracking on all of our subjects. So you might be able to get it from the lab ones and not on the online ones and so forth. And so this talk is exploring the methodological issues involved in combining potentially, what you might think of as like cheap, fast, out of control, massive behavioral data sets with more traditional, expensive, slow, and maybe noisy cogneuro data sets. And the thesis that I want to start out with that we're going to explore throughout the talk is the idea that massive behavioral data sets collected online or in the lab or whatever are in fact massive cogneuro data sets, although most people think of the division between cogneuro and behavioral data sets as being a pretty strong wall. And the way to think about it is that the behavioral data sets are just ones where recordings of the brain data are essentially missing data. So you might find that idea kind of absurd or trivial, like, yeah, of course, the people online don't have their brain measurements, you would call them missing. But let's just see what we can do with this idea if we explore it a little bit. So there's no question that cognitive science has a problem with trying to create bigger and more generalizable data sets, and cogneuro has an even larger one with respect to that. So much has been written in recent years about how small sample sizes that are typical of neuroimaging studies affect replicability and the strength of statistical inference, right? And like most fields in psychology at this point, this issue is becoming relatively well understood and front and center in most researchers' minds. Changes are happening. 11 subject fMRI studies are no longer the norm, and we're understanding more about the issues with replicability and generalizability and so forth. So a lot of cognitive neuroscience is kind of directed at trying to use, a lot of times general linear models thrown at relatively simple question, which is, what's the relationship between measures of neural activity and brain function and cognitive variables or constructs like prediction error or, signals of surprise or memory representation, memory updating, and so forth. So plotted here is kind of a hypothetical scenario, right, where we want to understand some brain measure relates to some cognitive variable. That's basically all we're doing. And it's well appreciated that errors in the measurement of either of these variables can cause attenuation of the regression slope estimate, essentially bringing it closer to zero and making it, decreasing the power to detect any possible relationship that might exist between the cognitive variable and the brain measure, right? So therefore, if we want to know something about this function, improvements in estimation should help protect us from incorrect and overconfident inferences. Now, usually we think about this in the context of the signal to noise characteristics of the neural measurements themselves, right? Like, so what we need to do is improve the quality of our neural measurements because they are typically noisy. So, we'll get a bigger magnet perhaps, or maybe we'll get more trials per subject, or we'll improve the pre-processing pipelines and artifact detection and so forth, and trying to improve the quality of the brain signal that we get. But this concept, or the at least in theory, applies also to cognitive variables. So methods for better estimating these variables are also likely to improve the quality of the neural estimation. And that, as I see it, is central to the theme of why we gathered in this workshop today, is to think about ways in which we can improve, ultimately, estimation of cognitive variables in clever ways, right? Okay, so this is a paper, and our working title for the paper is Getting Blood from a Stone, and it's basically a simulation and archival data analysis exploring how behavioral data collected typically outside the context of any kind of neural measurement can actually improve the identification of brain behavior correlations. So let's start by considering examples. So you're a young, early career researcher. You just got your first MRI study that relates some behavior. We don't know what it is, but it's blank for some behavior that you make choice data or whatever. And you've made some measurement with using some type of neuroimaging method. And what we're often interested in is the relationship between these variables, like a correlation, right? Like, so here's your 25-person MRI study that costs you $20,000 to conduct, and here's the plot that's going to go into your Science or Nature paper, right? Now, imagine that you have a rich friend or maybe a family member, maybe this person's named Uncle Sam, and Sam gives you $500,000 because he really wants to know the answer to this question, like really wants to know, what is the relationship between this behavior and this brain signal. So you spend $250,000 of that on subject fees, and maybe the rest is the personnel costs for your postdoc and graduate student to work on this for maybe 2-3 years. And we get a bigger sample now, right? And this is better, right? Like our larger sample, we have less uncertainty about the magnitude of the correlation that exists. Points that might have been seeming suspect as being outliers are kind of part of the nice compact parts of the sample and stuff like that. And so we're overall in a better case. But let's step back and kind of do a counterfactual. So like, what if instead we ran 500 additional behavior-only subjects? So meaning we didn't record their brain measure at all. We just had them perform whatever behavioral task that you're measuring, okay? And that's indicated here by a kind of more dense representation of the marginal distribution on the behavior here. And so at first step, you're probably thinking this is part of this step into the theater of the absurd, right? Is that this really tells me nothing, because if you didn't measure the brains of like 95% of your subjects, there's nothing that you can really learn about the brain signal and the brain correlation. But before we entirely write this idea off, let's go back to the thesis, right? Which is that behavioral data sets are, in a way, massive cogneural data sets with the brain data missing. So if you take this approach, you can go back to the statistics literature and look at a pretty well-developed body of statistical insight about how to make observations when observations are missing for various reasons. And this book by Little and Rubin is a classic in that, that field. So to try to keep things light, I'm going to try to go through being a stats professor for a second. So you have heard of something called Pearson's R, right? What maybe people don't know is that the maximum likelihood estimate for bivariate correlation with missing data is not actually Pearson's R, the normal correlation score that we often use in psychology. So we have to introduce two different terms here. There's going to be the variance of the behavioral data using the data points on when we collected both variables. And then there's this other variance, which is the behavioral data using all the data points. And this new, they can come up with a new correlation coefficient called Anderson's rho, which is a well-known statistical estimator, that is a modification of Pearson's R for the missing data case. And the value of rho hat here depends on the ratio of those two variance terms and the Pearson R that was collected on the data within both variables. So Anderson's rho estimate has a lower mean squared error than Pearson's R asymptotically in a missing data case. And it's sort of like a transformation. So you can kind of think of like here, the different colors of these curves are the value of Pearson's R. There's sort of a translated value of Anderson's rho that depends on these noise characteristics of the data that you've sampled. So you can convert between the two of them. So using that, like we can, that's the limiting case, but we can use cycles and simulations and so forth to kind of get some intuitions about the kind of question that I think actually Tom kind of framed in his talk was about like sort of like, what's the relative benefit of doing certain types of behavioral data collection, like collecting people on the scanner versus collecting people possibly in the lab or online or something like that, like collecting behavior only. So here what I'm plotting is the error in the estimation of the correlation coefficient, right? So like this is, you want this value to be low. So the lower you are closer to 0, that would be good. Okay, and then what I plotted here is the blue line is the Pearson correlation from a hypothetical sample where the true correlation is 0.4 and the number of subjects who had both fMRI and let's say behavior recorded from them was 50. So we had a 50 sample fMRI study, right? And then I'm asking the question here, what if I added one more neuro subject, like I recorded one more fMRI subject? In expectation, I expect my error in the estimation of the correlation to go down, so I get closer to the truth, right? Which is what you expect. As you get more data, you get more and more robust estimates, so that's good. But we can also ask, like, what would happen if I added additional behavioral subjects? The Pearson correlation is not a function of the number of behavioral only subjects that you ran because it doesn't know how to fuse information from people who had both measurements versus people that only had one. But the Anderson row actually can take advantage of the marginal distribution of the behavioral scores in order to get a more robust estimate of the correlation. So the missing data correlation by adding additional behavioral subjects improves. And it's kind of interesting even to read off this graph. So the place where the green curve and the orange curves cross is in fact the place where a certain number of behavioral subjects in expectation would do as much good for you in your estimation error as adding one more neuro subject. So you can see like around 50 subjects here, the curve crosses over, implying that like there's at some point you can actually, by running more people outside the scanner, you can essentially make up the same statistical precision as running another person in the scanner. Now this is for a particular combination of these, so let's call them parameters, right? Like the certain number of people who you made measurements of both the brain and the behavior, and there's a true underlying correlation that's reasonably strong here. We can imagine that for all different kinds of settings, like small sample studies, large sample studies here, going from top to bottom, or higher true correlation versus lower true correlation, and can see the cases where the Anderson's estimator provides a more, like less variable estimate of the correlation coefficient. And you can see that it works reasonably well for cases where there's mild to strong correlations between the behavioral measure and the brain signal, and in cases where there's a large, reasonably large number of subjects who have both measurements made. So I can kind of zoom in on that crossover point right here, right, where the true correlation is between 0.3 and 0.4, and the number of people who you made joint measurements on both measures is around 50. You can see there's a phase transition there, and kind of like as we move around, there's kind of a ridge there that the weaker the correlation that you expect to have between the brain and behavior, the more it makes sense to get a good, robust initial sample of subjects that have both measurements in order to make this this process this work. So small true correlations or small neural data sets kind of don't have enough signal, and then it adds variance, making the average get worse. But generally, this approach decreases the bias, but sometimes can increase the variance when the estimates of the bivariate correlation from your joint sample are weak. Okay, so putting into practice, we looked at some data sets and like kind of wanted to play with like kind of what the implications of this would be. So we looked at the human connectomy data set, and it's a really interesting data set, partly because of kind of a relatively simple, straightforward structure to it. There's over 1,000 subjects with fMRI measurements on various measures of their brain. Most of these are structural things like, you know, white matter volume and stuff like that. But they also did on these subjects a variety of behavioral measures that look at performance on spatial, language, working memory tasks, and so forth. We'll look at one large correlation in particular, which is total gray matter volume versus performance on some spatial tasks. And we'll create like 1,000 bootstrap samples with different amounts of behavioral and then joint data. So we can downsample the data, pretend as though those subjects didn't actually have their gray matter volume recorded, and see whether we can assess the true underlying or how close we can get to guessing the true correlation between those two measures in the larger data set, which is kind of an estimate of our population error. And here we recreate some of our simulation plots here showing that like the Anderson row estimate, mean squared error of that estimate decreases as you add subjects who only provided information about their marginal from their behavior. And that crossover point of adding the benefit that you get from adding behavioral subjects versus running one more imaging subject crosses over at quite reasonable values, like 100 or even 25 or something like that, showing that you can improve your estimates with behavioral data alone. Now, we looked at a couple of other ones, and it didn't always work. So it used to be good to be truth in advertising. So here we looked at working memory task accuracy and gray matter volume. And here the Anderson row estimate actually becomes slightly less close in terms of the mean squared error estimate as you add an additional behavioral only data. Not completely unexpected given that kind of bigger array of plots that I showed you earlier, but one possible reason for that is that the working memory task accuracy is itself a very non-Gaussian type distribution, the one here on the left. And the Anderson row asymptotic properties are all predicated on taking advantage of the bivariate Gaussian structure of data. And if you don't have that, then the test sort of is going to be violated. So I think we'll return to this issue a little bit later, but the main point is to be thinking about the ways in which you can benefit these kind of things and trying to develop new methods that work for more complicated cases. Okay, so making a little bit of a transition though, you can imagine that like some questions in cognitive neuroscience take the form of this correlational structure. Like you're trying to estimate essentially the bivariate correlation between two measures. But a lot of times it's actually more like a regression problem. So, you know, maybe Niv might say, you know, I don't know all of the work that she does relative to how much of it's correlational versus regression, but certainly in the case of reinforcement learning, a common method is to identify something like a latent cognitive variable like prediction error, and then to regress that parameter onto brain voxels to try to find which ones are significantly loading on that latent variable of interest. So the point to make here, though, is that latent behavioral variables like prediction error or any other behavioral measure that you might extract from a cognitive model are necessarily like estimated, right? They're going to depend on a number of factors. They're going to depend, if it's model-based behavioral estimates, it's going to depend on the quality of the model, the way in which you search for parameters in the space to fit the model, the number of trials you included in your experiment. Does it pin down the latent cognitive variable of interest sufficiently and stuff like that? Misestimation of this signal, if it can decrease the power in model-based fMRI for that reason. And so you can kind of think of a case where here again, you're going to argue that maybe using extra behavioral data, possibly collected more cheaply and not in the context of cognitive measurements, might improve these estimates. And there's a number of reasons why that's kind of obviously the case. So like if you are fitting a model and the model's been validated on a large number of stimulus conditions, let's say, lots of different combinations of experiment conditions, then you can probably do improved model selection. You're able to get some of the parameters more with precise estimates and also choose between classes of models better. You can also, through hierarchical modeling, get some benefit as well, right? Because if you include hierarchical parameter estimates, then you take advantage of shrinkage and things like that that are going to regularize some of the individual parameter estimates. So that can also be advantageous in a lot of cases. But can we say something any more general? Because like a lot of the statements that would go along with saying something like that would be like, well, yeah, sometimes hierarchical modeling might work, but it would depend on the model that you were dealing with and the noise characteristics and so forth. Can we say anything more general? And so the way we kind of went to approach this is to ask the question is like, how does the power of model-based fMRI depend on the model fit? And Bob Wilson and Yale Niv of 2014 have a really interesting paper that investigated this, this issue for single subject inferences. And we extend their results into group level inferences. So the question that we're asking is, how does the increase in power from improving the correlation between model estimates of a parameter and the true parameters compare to getting another fMRI subject? Okay, that's the trick that we're going to use here. So imagine we have a latent cognitive variable, like let's say prediction error. That's going to be the CIT. So for every subject at point T, we get a prediction error signal. We're going to assume the standard 2-level fMRI model for voxel level activity. So the voxel activity is some linear function of the latent variable of the subject with some noise, which is going to be the noise is going to be largely dominated by the fMRI signal noise. And then at the group level inference, we're going to ask the question of like, is that voxel significantly at the group level carrying, related to reward prediction error? There's a second stage model selection that people often do. There, the noise parameters are related to the distribution of effect sizes of this initial effect that you expect to see in the population. So kind of individual differences in how strongly the brain signal might manifest the reward prediction error. So the problem is that we only have estimates of the cognitive latent variable that are correlated with rho with the true latent cognitive variable. So the question is, what is our expected power for getting a significant beta weight? And it's going to depend, in fact, on a number of variables. So in addition to the correlation between the model estimates and the true latent variables, it's going to depend on the number of trials per subject, the number of subjects you run, a variable that we call the CNR, which is the average contrast to fMRI noise ratio, and this other one, which I can't even pronounce because it's GFVR, but it's the ratio of the between subject variance of the CNR to the fMRI noise measurement. What you get is that you can get an analytic equation for the expected group T-stat here. This is like the form that it actually has. And then the expected power is going to depend on the value of T, the expected value of T and N. So taking a look at like how this kind of plays out, we can plot here for a case where we have an experiment with 50 trials per subject. with certain parameters associated with the noise parameters and the between subject variance parameters. And the CNR in this case is probably set a little bit low relative to what is typically reported in the field, but we'll just use this as a case example here. So then what we're talking about on the x-axis is the correlation between the estimates and the true parameters. So you estimated prediction error. How close is that prediction error to the true prediction error? Okay, it could be 0 correlation or it could be like 100% correlated, right? So we'll range along this scale here. And this is the power, the group level stat power associated with running 25 fMRI subjects, okay? So as we add additional subjects, we can see these curves increase the power, which makes sense. Like as you add subjects to your fMRI design, you're increasing your power to detect this relationship. But what's sort of interesting is this issue, right? So if you were at a particular level of correlation, like a particular low level of correlation between the estimates and the true parameters, and you could ask the question, what if I could do something? I don't know what it is. It could be improved model search, better models, hierarchical modeling, that would move my correlation between the estimates higher, then I would like move up this curve basically. So on the 25, I would slide up this curve just by improving the estimates between the model and the true parameters, like better fitting my model, right? Like whatever method we're agnostic about how you do this. We're just pointing out that you can, whatever method you use to improve your model, it's going to move you up this curve, right? And then you can sort of like back project from that improvement to the same level of power and kind of do the cost benefit trade-off in those terms. So the question is like, how many additional fMRI subjects is it worth improving your correlation between the model parameters and the true parameters by 0.1 or something like that? And so like in this case, you could read off and say that improving your model this much is about the same as adding 5 subjects to your fMRI design, which I think is kind of an interesting and compelling trade-off about like, you know, how much better it can get to get a good cognitive model when you're trying to do these kind of things versus just the blunt force thing that most people do, which is think of just adding more fMRI subjects. So the root problem movement, yeah. And so there's also, interestingly, only a range of achievable power values that are approachable with improvements in the correlation. So there's going to be some diminishing returns here. These curves kind of flatten out. And at some point, right, there's a power that's achievable that is available to, if you ran more subjects at a reasonably high correlation, that's not going to be possible to catch up to by just improving the correlation between the parameter estimates and the true parameters, and so then you can ask the question like, well, how would I know when I'm likely to be there? Because these things are analytic equations, you can kind of come up with like the cutoff curve where the places where it would be better to improve your model parameters versus add more subjects. You can kind of come up with like a analytic decision rule across a number of different scenarios to tell you when that's the right thing to do. And in general, it helps more when there's a small number of trials. So this actually opens up opportunities in some ways for new types of low trial experiment fMRI designs, in the sense that if you have a small number of trials, but you know a lot about the stimulus, you know a lot about the cognitive operations that are going on, then potentially you can leverage extra data sets in order to enable you to make inferences about brain behavior correlations that wouldn't be possible otherwise in less powered designs. So just to sum up, pulling together samples of samples where in some set of the sample, both behavior and brain were recorded, and in other sets of the sample, only behavior were recorded, can improve statistical precision and power. Applied to existing data sets of neural data, it enables us to kind of like get blood from a stone. So you kind of imagine that you go online and you find some existing fMRI data set. Some people mentioned earlier about the concerns for early career researchers and funding opportunities, right? But one of the lessons from that is like there's all these online data sets of fMRI, for instance, that you could download. What we're saying here is that like you could actually access those archival data, run additional cheap behavioral data sets in your lab or online that would act as like ancillary to those data sets and potentially extract additional statistical power or even refine some of the conclusions out of an existing data set, even though that data set was already published and archived. So that's why we call this paper like getting blood from a stone, because you're squeezing out additional statistical power out of an existing data set by getting kind of like augmented data that's collected in another way. Now, to be honest, there are limitations. When your sample of the brain and behavior is too small to have enough information about the correlation, it's more difficult given current methods, and that's why there's reason for people to be looking into these kind of methods and trying to push the boundary on these. And also when the nature of your data strongly violate the assumptions of some of these traditional statistical estimators, you kind of can't make miracles happen, which is again another reason why the field could be thinking about this data fusion problem as an interesting methodological advance for scaling cognitive science. So discussions just to think about while you're eating lunch or whatever is just that, data fusion, pulling together heterogeneous samples, things where there's missing data are likely to be methodological challenges for this scaling cognitive science revolution. So people who are interested in working on that, I think that's a really important topic to consider alongside building tools and so forth. And it's all work that can be done relatively low cost. But also, it's interesting to think about when we talk about scaling cognitive science, like can we impact aligned fields like cognitive neuroscience? So can these ideas contribute beyond simply better refining cognitive models and behavior, but actually we can show the value of this approach by showing that it can also improve aligned fields like cogneuro. Okay, so I'll leave it for any questions, but we thank our funding from the National Science Foundation for this work.
All right, thanks, Todd. I just a quick announcement, and then we're going to do questions because we have a fairly short lunch break. It's scheduled for just half an hour. However, our talk starting after the break is actually recorded. So you should watch it online. It'll be on the website momentarily. There will be a link. And we will start Q&A at 1:10, just to let you know. So for people who want to ask Todd questions, please go ahead and stick around. For people who need to jet off for lunch, go ahead and jet off, and we'll just take time for a couple questions.
Todd, I have a question.
Yep.
Thank you, great talk. I was wondering, like, it seems that the analytical aspects that comes from the Gaussian assumption could be basically somehow relaxed if you would basically consider that the cognitive data comes with distributions that are attractively non-Gaussian, and you can actually see them and potentially leverage in that and getting improvement in the cases that your estimates were actually biased because of Gaussian analytical assumption. So maybe you can speak to that.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. And like, yeah, the traditional thing I think in cognitive science, and certainly the approach that I'm most familiar with, is the kind of like, in cases where you don't think the world is going to work in these nice Gaussian cases, is to build more complicated generative models that match your data better, and then see if you can make the same types of inferences that you get in these analytic cases, but ones that you probably have to work out by simulation, stuff like that. I think there's also like, kind of going along with what you're hinting at is that, once you know a lot about that marginal distribution, then it's likely that the transfer of that distribution to new populations is probably a function that can be estimated reasonably well. So like, for example, like if you ran a large number of people online, you might have a distribution of scores, but of course everyone knows that the online data sets have different noise characteristics than laboratory data sets or whatever. But presumably there's like a mapping between that data set and the lab data set. Like there's just a scale of the standard deviation or something like that, or there might be a change in the mode or something like that. And so leveraging that kind of mapping between getting a good guess about like how online data generally tends to compare to lab data, and then lab data in the scanner to lab data outside the scanner and stuff like that, are one way that you might be able to like graft information non-parametrically from one data set to the next one. But I think these are all, I think exactly that, like there are limitations, but there's plenty of solutions that people could be exploring.
Okay, I have one question for you, Todd, real quick.
Yep.
Which is, I was wondering if you wanted to make, are interested in I was interested in your point about improving the model, and I wonder if there's a broader point to be made here about statistical power in general, which statistical power, we often think of the way you deal with it as have more subjects, but power is always going to be relative to the amount of noise in your measurements. And part of the reason power is so low in psychology is that our measurements tend to be pretty crappy. And I was wondering if this is clearly something you've been thinking about. I'm wondering if you had more to say about that.
Well, yeah, so absolutely, that's the fundamental, we've we the entire setup of this talk and paper are about these issues in estimation rather than in the more traditional, like just hypothesis testing type of framework. Like, does this happen or not? Like, the point is that certainly you need to improve that estimation. And when I thought about it, like in the context of the scaling cognitive science kind of issue, you know, there's all kinds of issues about overfitting the small data sets that we have. So like the idea would be that, like, you know, if you fit a model to only your subjects from your MRI study, you're gonna have a slight misestimation because it's gonna depend on how many trials you ran or whatever. You're not gonna get those parameters exactly right. And then you're sacrificing statistical power as a result of that choice, right? And so the question is, if you tell people, well, you need to fix that issue, they'll say, well, it's too expensive because it requires me to run so many more MRI subjects. And I think the point, though, is that actually in the context of a model-based analysis of behavior, there's many ways that you can improve the precision of your parameter estimates that are cheaper, basically. You know, like they involve just modeling methodology, like searching for better parameters, assessing fit in better ways, and so forth. But they also can come down to collecting additional data that's more cheaply collected, and it can allow you to get more precise estimates that way. So yeah, so I think that's fundamental to this entire endeavor, which is just saying that, like, you know, we shouldn't turn our back on the important role that cognitive science can play in trying to get those estimation error down, basically, for things that are of importance and of interest to people.
Okay, great. Well, thank you everybody for a great morning.